peace action in Washington. And we have various working groups, one of which is the Palestine-Israel working group that I'm have been part of since about 2014. And that was when Palestine became an issue that MAPA embraced. Prior to that, it was a little more fringy for the mainstream peace movement, and thankfully that's something that's changed. So it's an important part of MAPA's work, and one of the main areas. And of course, not just MAPA, but the peace movement in general has gotten on board with this issue in a big way in 10 years or so. So that's progress as far as I can say. So we'll get started. I know more people will be coming in, but we've waited enough. So let me welcome everybody on behalf of Massachusetts Peace Action and our Palestine-Israel Working Group. We're very privileged here to have two extremely knowledgeable guests to talk about this issue, which is the politics of Israel and Palestine in the US. For most of you as supporters of Palestinian rights, it won't come as any surprise to understand that one of the principal impediments to Palestinians achieving self-determination and human rights is the unconditional support given to Israel and its government by our country, which is manifested in many ways. The US defends Israel diplomatically, especially in the United Nations. We've used more vetoes on resolutions to hold Israel accountable than any other issue in the United Nations. We also every year supply Israel with $3.8 billion in direct military aid, with little or no debate and almost unanimous from both parties. And an extra billion was added as a bonus last year because Israel had expended a lot of rockets in attacking Gaza. So the US Congress very generously supplied them with an extra $1 billion to restock their missiles. Besides the direct US aid, there are many other parts of the budget that support Israel in one way or another. And in our tax code, many, many millions of dollars a year are effectively spent by the US government in regarding Israel, pro-Israeli charities and political education activities as tax deductible. No one knows exactly what that adds up to, but it's quite a lot of money on top of the $3.8 billion. All in all, the US has supplied Israel with, in current dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in aid over the years, over the decades. What does that buy? Well, it buys the Israeli Air Force, for one, and many of the missiles and bombs it uses. And for example, just earlier this month, when Israel launched an attack on Gaza to assassinate 3 resistance figures, it also massacred 3 families in an apartment building in Gaza who were, by any account, innocent of anything. And they used US-made GBU 39 smart bombs to do it, donated courtesy of the US taxpayer, which makes us implicit in a way in war crime. So how does this happen? How does it happen that both parties routinely support and cheerlead Israel no matter what it does, even when the US technically sometimes disapproves of their policy with sort of mild clucking, but keeps the money and the political support rolling? How did we get to this point of bipartisan, unconditional support for Israel, particularly now that US public opinion, and especially Democratic Party public opinion, including millions of American Jews, have become much more skeptical about US support for Israel? And yet, at the top, nothing seems to change. How did we get to this point? If we can, with that, and let me say, Lara Friedman is works with the Foundation for Middle East Peace and produces an indispensable weekly legislative roundup of pretty much everything that's going on in Washington related to Israel and Palestine. And Michael Aria is the U.S. correspondent for Mondo Weiss, which is another indispensable source of information and opinion regarding our issue. So these are two well-experienced experts that I hope will enlighten us all with their view. So first of all, the question is, how did we get to this place? Why does the U.S. unconditionally support Israel through thick and thin? Lara, maybe you start.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone who showed up this evening for this conversation. I apologize, I have a cold, which is why I sound like this. You started us off with a giant question, and I'm not going to go back over history since 48 forward. I'll kind of try to do this in a nutshell and then pass it on to Michael and let him do all the heavy lifting. Look, the bottom line is the U.S. has always supported Israel from the birth of the nation, from Israel, when Israel was first declared a state, and the quick declaration of recognition. There's all different theories on why the U.S. supported Israel. You can argue it that it was in terms of the politics of the day and the residual sense of having to make good on the failure to protect Jews in World War II. Of course, if you're Obama and you say anything like that, they'll call you an anti-Semite, so be careful. You can talk about the shared values, the plucky Americans who settled this great nation of America don't talk about Native Americans and what was done to them, seeing an analogous sort of heroic settlement and promised land for Jews in the Holy Land. You can see the religious side of it, which even from the early days, the Christian sort of promised land and the ingathering of the Jews for the end times, which was, you heard the beginnings of that early on. And then the bottom line, and this is I think what most of us focus on the most today, is the structure of the US political system, which is extremely responsive to domestic pressure. And fundamentally, from 1947, I would argue, 46, whenever you want to state it, to the present, US relations with Israel are first and foremost a domestic policy issue with very, very strong domestic constituencies that are deeply devoted to this. It's sort of like when you ask why do we still have an embargo on Cuba? These are very, very deeply held relationships. The primary amongst them is Jewish Americans, who, by the way, if you go back from 48 to the present, have waxed and waned on their support for Israel. And if you go from 48 to 67, if you look at that period, and people like Michael Barnett have written about this, you see a much tenser, a much more friction in that relationship, much less self-identification of Jewish Americans with Israel. After 67, my generation, the Gen Xers, we grew up with parents who had lived through the shock of 67 and then 73 and seen Israel victorious and came away from it, a lot of them, with a sense of identification and a sense of self-fulfillment almost, in the idea of a Jewish Israel that wasn't afraid, that was strong, that was safe, that was unapologetic. However you pull all those different threads together, though, and there's all sorts of theories, and you can talk about the geopolitical interests of having a friend in the region as a home base for protecting oil or protecting geostrategic areas in the Middle East and the Suez Canal and all of that. The bottom line is that it has been an article of faith now for decades that the US more or less stands by Israel. And to the extent that it criticizes or disagrees with Israel, and you can go back almost, I think the last time you go back to any kind of meaningful pushback, you have to go back to the Clinton era, or you have to go back to Bush before Clinton with the loan guarantees, and then Clinton kind of twisting arms around Camp David. But aside from that, the bottom line is we don't, as a matter of US policy, we don't want to clash with Israel publicly, and we don't want to put real pressure on Israel. And when an administration does push harder, Congress tends to play Congress softens the blow. And where we are today, and that's been largely bipartisan all along. It's interesting to say that actually it was less bipartisan if you go back in recent history before the era of the Tea Party. If you go back before the era of the Tea Party, you had, Democrats in Congress who were more and less in the defending Israeli impunity overall else. They're on both sides, but on the Republican side, you had a number of internationalist Republicans or more conservative in terms of international adventurous Republicans who didn't have a lot of Jewish constituents, arguably, who saw Israel basically as a simple foreign policy issue and tended to take positions that were, often more critical of Israel. With the advent of the Tea Party era, and then what's followed with the growth of a different kind of Republican Party, and then Trump and where we are today, what you see is a Republican Party for whom absolute support for Israel, meaning the hardest line support you can imagine for whatever Israel does or wants to do, is right up there with being anti-abortion or anti-trans or anti-gay rights. It's right there. It's one of the core red meat issues for the Republican Party. And on the Democratic side, you have this really interesting breakdown, which was just alluded to in the introduction, where you have the grassroots of Americans who are less and less supportive of Israel, or at least more and more supportive of rights for everybody and not having an Israel exception when it comes to rights for Palestinians. That's the grassroots, but a Democratic Party that, except for its it's split between a progressive flank that is accountable and aligned with the grassroots, and there's a legacy party leadership, which effectively is scrambling to stay with or get to the right of Republicans. And that's why when you sort of look at Congress day to day, as Michael and I do, what you see is one of the rare areas of bipartisan unity during the Trump era and through the present day is legislation that is either asserting support for and more funding for Israel, or is aimed at bashing the Palestinians. I'll stop there.
All right, we'll get back into some of those issues in more detail, but now, Michael, could you respond to the initial question?
Sure. Well, I would just echo a lot of what Lara just said. In 1948, obviously, support existed from the beginning. I think, if you look back at that time, the State Department, I don't think was as strongly committed to Israel. And, things, I think, really changed in 1967 as the US government began to view the country as a means to, destroy an emerging secular Arab nationalism that was beginning to thrive at the time. But I also think she makes a great point insofar as to say, people are coming at this from all different angles. Sometimes I think about, like the anti-communism of the 1950s. I think many politicians were true believers, like, people like Joe McCarthy, like they thought communists were everywhere, hiding behind bushes and stuff. And then there were people who might have thought it was kind of all nonsense, but they knew they had to go along with the party line or else, lose their political career. And I think you see a similar situation here. I mean, whether it's, Christian Zionism or, she alluded to Trump or, whatever factors, people are coming to this from all different angles. And I don't think it actually matters what people truly believe. I think during Trump, we had obviously an administration that, blatantly supported Israel, blatantly anti-Palestinian, and they were upfront about it. Whereas, the Obama administration or the Biden administration, just a few days ago, an evacuated settlement that was evacuated as part of the agreement between Bush and Ariel Sharon in 2005 was reestablished. And, the State Department put out a statement, talking about how they were deeply troubled by this move. And, as somebody who has to watch all the State Department briefings as part of my job, the amount of times that they use words like troubled, it's pretty staggering, but it doesn't do anything in terms of policy, of course. I mean, this is, when Biden ran for president, he criticized Bernie Sanders, who floated the idea of conditioning aid to Israel and called the idea of conditioning military aid to Israel a, quote, gigantic mistake. And, that's how the administration has played this. We've seen harsh words, sometimes very harsh when it comes to certain things, but no real action or no real drive to hold Israel accountable. And I would just add, the base, and I'm sure we might talk about this later, but, the numbers show us that the people who vote for Democrats are really shifting and are coming around on this issue in like a big staggering way. University of Maryland poll a couple months ago, 44% of Democrats say Israel is a state with segregation similar to apartheid. There was a Gallup poll in March, I think 56% of Democrats viewed Israel favorably. That was down from 63% just a year ago. Gallup, for the first time since they've been doing this polling, a majority of Democratic voters said that they sympathize with Palestinians over Israelis. That's the first time that's ever happened since they started doing it in the, I think, early 2000s. I think things are changing in that respect. I think people are becoming more aware of this issue, and people who vote Democrat or consider themselves progressive are coming around on this. And this is maybe on the radar of liberals and progressives in a way that it wasn't, 10 or 20 years ago. But it's just like any other issue. I think, whether it's Medicare for all or, the Green New Deal, all kinds of things. You see polling that says the Democratic voters are to the left of the people that they elect when it comes to this stuff. So I think Israel has just become another one of those issues where the base is certainly to the left of the political establishment. I'm sure we'll get into this, but there has been some cracks in that establishment. I think obviously there's some Democrats we cover quite a bit who have done some good stuff in this regard. But yeah, the overwhelming majority, of course, in the establishment has not really changed that much since Israel was first established, I'd say.
Just a little bit of a historical note about how the party alignments have changed on this issue is, as many of you know, when President Truman wrote a letter recognizing the state of Israel on the day it was declared, he was strongly opposed by his own Secretary of State. General Marshall threatened that he would not vote for Truman's reelection if he took that step. And Republicans were even more skeptical in those days. It's hard to remember now, but President Eisenhower basically read Israel the Riot Act when they invaded Sinai in 1956 and threatened them very overtly with action if they did not withdraw. And they did withdraw from Sinai as a result of that. And in the weaponry used by Israel in its wars prior to the late 60s and early 70s were not US weapons, they were British and French weapons primarily. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the US started to supply weapons in large amounts to Israel. So now we have the situation where the Republican Party, the party that descends from Dwight Eisenhower, is now sort of the super fanatical pro-Israel party. And the leadership of the Democratic Party competes with them for that moniker, while the Democratic voters, as Michael and Lara both said, are getting skeptical about this relationship and about Israel as a democracy. So things have evolved a lot, and not necessarily in a good direction. I guess the question is, Michael, you alluded to the fact that now, for the first time, there's a meaningful opposition to the status quo of US policy toward Israel in the Congress, not just at the grassroots, but in the Congress. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm sure people who are watching know that there's, I think an increasing, or I guess they would have lost, Marie Newman and some others, but they've gained a couple more, I think, who have been on the bills that people like me and Lara cover, the Betty McCollum bill, and other things that just highlight, Palestinian human rights, or some of the few pieces of legislation that criticize Israel in any way or aim to hold it accountable. Yeah, I think, we've seen, whatever it is, 12, you see these bills where it's like 12, 13 people, 14 people. It's not a lot compared, of course, to the amount of people who are in the House or the amount of people who are in Congress. We also don't really have that kind of flank in the Senate, of course, which is a much more conservative institution. There still is not a companion bill, for instance, for Betty McCollum's bill in the Senate. Although there was pressure to get someone like Bernie or I know Warren to introduce one when it was first developed. But yeah, it's interesting. I think it is slowly growing, but I think that the mainstream narrative, like when you see Rashida Tlaib covered by the mainstream media, her policies are often covered in a way as if to suggest that she's out of step with the mainstream of the Democratic Party, when actuality, like we were saying, the numbers reflect that she's just acting on behalf of her constituents. And all these lawmakers, the squad and others are passing things that the people who voted for them want them to pass. And I think it's notable, and because this is done by mass peace action, I would just mention, off the top of my head, connected to this, somebody like Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman, obviously in Massachusetts, in Boston. At this point, I think I've been covering her since she came into the House. If you remember, like when she first was elected, when Trump initially referred to the four of them as squad, which I think was just like a racist, he was just making a racist comment, referring to four non-white women that way. But when you actually looked at their politics, she seemed, I guess you could say, like a little more traditionally liberal than the other ones, right? I mean, she had backed Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. She's the only one who endorsed, Elizabeth Warren over Bernie during the 2020 election. And then there was that vote to condemn the BDS movement a few years ago. There's been so many of these, sometimes I conflate them, but I remember she was the only member of the squad to vote to condemn it, and put out a very interesting statement that I'm sure people who are watching this or involved with your organization remember, where she kind of, her reasoning behind voting for this condemnation of the BDS movement was that she was acting in line with her Jewish constituents, and she faced real pushback from many progressive Jews, I think, in her district, and many Palestine activists in her district, many of whom, like, we've spoke to Amanda Wise for stories. And I think over time, like if you look at her like track record on this, I mean, you fast forward to like the Iron Dome vote, for instance, and she's one of the only Democratic Congress people to vote against it, right? And I think that's the one that AOC voted present for. So not even every squad member voted for that one either. And Betty McCollum voted for the Iron Dome funding. Other people who, are good on this issue when it comes to other pieces of legislation. So I just bring that up as a way to say that, I think it's happening slowly, but I think things can change, and they often do change as a result of pressure from, groups like this one and others when it comes to, your elected representatives. And I think when it comes to when we talk about the small amount of House members who have emerged now as being pretty good on this issue, and bringing it up and having press conferences and signing letters and introducing legislation, I think it's a testament to the work, of course, that activists, particularly Palestinian activists, have done for years to even, get to this point. And I just think that's something we should always keep in mind whenever this happens. These shifts obviously aren't happening because politicians wake up one day and think that they've suddenly changed their mind on a huge issue like this. It's because they're hearing stuff from people in their communities, or, the political winds are beginning to shift and they can kind of see it. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
So I should respond in terms of Ayanna Pressley. Until the last cycle, I was a constituent of hers. I got redistricted to another representative since then. And yes, indeed, she has evolved in a very much better direction on this issue from the get-go. In fact, she had a lot of support when she first ran against Michael Capuano, who was kind of middling, not a super rah-rah Israel guy, but sometimes critical. Ayanna Pressley had a lot of funding from pro-Israel money, including the Kraft family, who own the New England Patriots. And I think they are certainly suffering from buyer's remorse in that respect, as she has evolved to be, one of the most outspoken people in the House of Representatives on this issue. So sorry for that digression, but we're very fortunate to have Pressley in our state, and she's outstanding. So Lara, do you want to comment on that question of how much things are changing in the sort of political establishment?
Sure, and I think Michael summarized it really well in terms of what's happening in the House right now. A couple of maybe adjacent points I think are worth making. Like things are definitely changing. I mean, that's the squad has not grown to maybe the size that activists would be excited for it to grow to, but there's clearly fear amongst the defenders of Israel, right or wrong, that it will. You only have to look at the last primary cycle where AIPAC for the first time launched an actual PAC. If you remember, up until now, if anybody said that AIPAC was a PAC, they would say you're ignorant, you don't know anything, and you're probably anti-Semitic. We just have the letters PAC in our name, but we're not a PAC. We're a public affairs committee, we're not a public action committee, so whatever. So they actually launched a PAC, and they engaged in what were safe seats in safe Democratic seats, primaries, in order to prevent the very progressive candidates from becoming the candidates for seats that would have been then won by Democrats. And except for two cases, one was Summer Lee, where they probably just, according to people I know who were involved in elections, they probably just engaged a little bit too late to get the result they wanted. And then one other case towards the end, I think in New York, they pretty much succeeded in every seat they tried, except, let's be clear, it turns out after the fact they did try against Ilhan, and they didn't succeed. Ilhan Omar in Minnesota, they did that via a stealth PAC where they went behind another PAC. They worked behind another PAC. That didn't succeed. But that was fundamentally what they showed there wasn't so much, I think, that they're afraid that if these people won, you'd suddenly have a majority of the House caucus that was, out there speaking for rights of Palestinians. I think what they were doing was trying to nip in the bud what they saw was a dangerous trend. And have a chilling effect going forward. And that chilling effect is both in terms of if you're a new candidate who wants to run, realizing that if you go on the wrong side of this issue, we will knock you down before you even are seriously in the running. And also, if you look at Andy Levin in Michigan, who was vulnerable because of redistricting, this is a Jewish member, part of a storied Jewish political family. There's been many Levins previously in Congress. And I mean, his sin, people pointed to his affiliation with J Street and talking about the two-state solution. I would argue plausibly that his bigger sin was defending his colleagues, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and legitimizing them as a Jewish, very legitimate member of Congress who wasn't considered beyond the pale, that his legitimizing of them was intolerable. But the fact that AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel as a parallel PAC, the fact that you saw millions of dollars, literally like millions and millions of dollars invested to prevent these very small candidates from very small districts from coming in really does send a clear message that there is concern that what's happening at the popular level is going to gradually make a difference in Congress. I think that's something that should give activists a sense of both optimism and pride, because that really does come, exactly as Michael said, from the work of Palestine rights activists for decades. I'd also just point out, we've mentioned Iron Dome a couple of times, and the vote around Iron Dome was fascinating. It was fascinating for the drama that we had in the House. It was fascinating for the partisan part where, Democrats ended up holding up in the House for I think 36 hours because they tried to push it through without any consideration as an amendment to a bigger bill. And then that was stopped and then it went through on its own. So maybe there was a 36-hour delay, and Democrats were just attacked by Republicans as anti-Israel, betraying Israel's interests, wanting to see more Jews die. We had language like that. And then it went to the Senate, and it sat in the Senate for months because you had a Republican, Rand Paul, who didn't want to move it. And that got and Democrats didn't play the same game. It was just fascinating. But the reason I'm pointing it out is, and this is really, citing my colleague Yusuf Munayyer, who's utterly brilliant, who looked at the Iron Dome thing and pointed out, it is remarkable that in selling Iron Dome to members of Congress and helping members of Congress justify their vote for this extra $1 billion for Israel, the language that AIPAC and others in the organizational Jewish world that were backing it used was, this is just a defensive weapon. It suddenly became necessary for the first time that I can remember, certainly in my life, to distinguish between defensive and potentially offensive weapons, and to make clear the sense of it. I've never seen anyone have to rationalize weapons to Israel before. It's the first time we've seen this language, which I think recognizes the shift in Congress, even for members who want to stay on the right side of AIPAC on these issues.
If we step back a little bit, of course, Israel's advocates in the United States and Israel itself always claim that this money is necessary for Israel to defend itself. But the real issue, of course, Iron Dome is manufactured in Israel. The real question is, who pays for it? Israel can produce as many Iron Dome missiles as it wants through its own funds, but uniquely among American allies, it's the only country that demands, a wealthy country that demands U.S. Subsidize its military budget like that. So Israel can defend itself just like the UK or France or Italy can defend itself. They don't ask for U.S. taxpayer money. So it's often lost in the shuffle, this idea that if we don't give this money, Israel can't defend itself. And of course, that's absurd. One other issue, though, about AIPAC's intervention in the primaries in the last cycle. AIPAC and other supporters of Israel in the United States claim that U.S. policy is very pro-Israel because the U.S. population is very pro-Israel. But it's interesting that in all the millions of dollars that they spent in those primaries, Israel was never mentioned in any of the ads that they took. The ads were typical opposition kind of research ads, and Israel was not an issue because I think they understand rightly that that's not a way to win Democratic voters. It's a way to alienate Democratic voters. So
if I could just add to that, I mean, it's even funnier. I mean, as an analyst, it's even more interesting than that, because as you say, in most of these races, they in no way identified themselves as AIPAC. They were under a name that did not in any way mention Israel or any way suggest any kind of foreign policy agenda. They're advertising. I'm in the DC area. I was subject to one of their races in a neighboring state. We saw ads like, every 5 minutes there was an ad, it seemed, for a while, none of them mentioning Israel. But if you looked at the aftermath in AIPAC's press releases, where they claimed that these were pro-Israel victories, right? So they ran a campaign in support of candidates that didn't mention Israel in any way, knowing that that wouldn't be an issue that would galvanize people to vote one way or the other. But then when people voted the way they wanted to vote, they claimed that proved that you have this grassroots support for members of Congress, for candidates who support Israel. So that was quite striking.
Michael, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, there's all kinds of funny stuff there, but my favorite part actually of that whole thing is that many of their ads attacking Democratic candidates centered around the fact that the candidates themselves were insufficiently devoted to the agenda of President Biden. And yet AIPAC, of course, is backed like over 100 GOP candidates who refuse to certify the election. So it's just everything about them is pretty funny in this regard. And to that point, it's like they have the PAC that's called the AIPAC PAC, but then the PAC that they used for the Democratic races was, of course, called the United Democracy Project, which, like as Lara says, just sounds kind of like vaguely liberal and good. But I think it's pretty telling. And you say the same stuff from Democratic Majority for Israel. I mean, they bankrolled all those ads targeting Bernie in 2020, right? About how he couldn't win and stuff like this. They never mentioned Israel. And yet when he lost, it was allegedly, they went into social media immediately and put out all these statements about how it was proof that, being pro-Israel is good politics within the Democratic Party. So I think it's important because I think it does show that there's a growing anxiety among these groups that Israel's brand really is suffering. And, these polls that we mentioned earlier, they're obviously aware of them. And, they know they can't mention Israel in these ads because they know it's not a winning issue anymore with these voters. So I think that's a point, so to say, for, our side.
Now, it's often said, again, by AIPAC and other pro-Israel organizations that, that the voters are on the side of Israel, and especially the Jewish voters. And yet, Jews in the United States make up 2% of the population, and most of them are loyal Democrats and liberals. So the votes are not so much the issue that candidates are afraid of, it seems to me, but something else. And with some hesitation, because if you mention money and Israel in the same sentence, you're immediately declared a possible anti-Semite. But certainly campaign financing in both parties plays a role in this, doesn't it?
I'll win. I mean, yes. I mean, looking at what happened in the primary, the only thing that's going to fix that is campaign finance reform, right? Whether it's the Democratic Party doing it unilaterally or something more broadly. mean, the bottom line is, and I've said this to audiences for 20 years, if you're unhappy with how, even before AIPAC was operating as an actual PAC, if you're unhappy with how this kind of influence and lobbying works, don't blame AIPAC and DMFI, blame our system, which has created an absolute legitimate way for people to weigh in, right? There's nothing illegal or illegitimate about the way that AIPAC is working the system, or DMFI or anybody else. And we can sort of laugh at the open hypocrisy. I'm pretty sure their answer would be, how naive are you? This is how politics works. You do what you need to do to get the people you want elected. And that really does come down to campaign finance reform. What happened during the primaries, I think, though, is quite telling, because you had some members of Congress calling out AIPAC and its PAC for what it was doing, and saying that this is deforming the primary process effectively, right? You don't end up with the candidates coming out of Democratic primaries. I mean, you had one candidate where where AIPAC basically supported the candidate in the primary and then supported the opponent of the candidate in the general, right? Effectively, you're letting the other side pick your candidates. And I think there was some pressure during this period on some party leaders to take a look at the way the primaries are financed. And the answer is no, we're not going to look at this. It's just too politically difficult. And that arguably has nothing to do with Israel. That has to do with everybody benefiting from the way the money comes in.
I mean, if I remember rightly, one of the main financiers of these negative campaigns against progressive Democrats was a Republican donor who started his own PAC. I forget in what state it was active, but clearly, both parties' establishments are worried about changing public opinion and maybe an effect in Congress from this changing opinion. So I'm somewhat optimistic that things are changing, but of course they're changing very, very slowly. I would say my count is that on one or another way of holding Israel accountable, there are up to 30 or in the 30s of people in Congress that are willing to sponsor a bill or sign a letter and so on. But that's not much in terms of making change. And so what do you think we should be doing in our movement that advocates a different policy with respect to Israel and Palestine and supports Palestinian human rights and self-determination? What can we do that's better? I guess campaign finance reform is one issue that we should all be working on, but more specifically, do you have any ideas?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in and just say that, the old adage about how, you should think globally and act locally, to my mind, that's always been kind of a misleading statement, because I think actually you can act globally as an extension of acting locally. And I think, we haven't talked about this yet, but a couple of the issues that me and Lara both cover quite consistently is, the anti-BDS laws that exist in people's states. And, this new round of battles that's taking place over the working definition of the IHRA. And I think if people are interested in this issue, if people, care about Palestine or care about the First Amendment, or, find this subject compelling, it is such a big subject, and it is framed that way. It's a go-to joke when, like on a sitcom, when someone's trying to think of something that you could never figure out, like the idea of like peace in the Middle East. And it's presented as this like huge daunting thing, even though I think we'd say the issue is a lot more simple than people make it out to be. It's pretty straightforward. But I think the scope of it also makes people think that people kind of help us, even if they care about it. And I would just say that, there's so many battles that are super important going on when it comes to this stuff in people's states, or in, their district, or in their community. And, a lot of the stuff seems small at the time, but I just think it adds up over time. I mean, that's how progress is made, and it ultimately, hopefully, impacts the political culture and ends up kind of impacting what lawmakers do in the future. I mean, like, for instance, Ben and Jerry's pulling out of Israel, was a massive flashpoint story for us, because it obviously, gained so much backlash. And you had, state lawmakers and AGs threatening to, pull out their investments in the parent company, among other things, denounced by all kinds of pro-Israel voices. And, the people who are working on that campaign in Vermont have been working on it for over a decade before Ben and Jerry's finally responded to them and finally took action. So I just think it's, stuff like that is a testament to the fact that this issue is it is a local issue. It is something. It's over $3.8 billion in taxpayer money, and it does impact people in their day-to-day lives, even if it seems like it doesn't. And there's probably some fight going on in your community or in your state right now. Palestine Legal has this on their website, a great resource, like this fantastic map of the United States, where you can click on your state and you can see what anti-BDS legislation exists or what's pending or what's coming up. And I would just say, that's a great way for people, I think, to get involved and kind of change the political culture over time.
Lara, do you have a comment on that?
I agree with everything Michael just said. I'd also say, the main piece of advice I have may seem really obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Listen to Palestinians. One of the reasons we are where we are today is that lots of well-intentioned Americans, Jewish Americans, people like me, for years were policing Palestinian language, telling them what the right way to achieve rights was. Don't use this language, don't do this, don't do that. Enough. Okay, we need to recognize that we need to be listening to the people, that they're at the tip of the spear is already going through them. When we talk about battles over BDS or the definition of anti-Semitism, I think a lot of us are maybe we feel there's a very strong argument to be made there about, First Amendment rights and basic freedoms of Americans everywhere. And if you don't protect freedoms here, then they're not going to be protected somewhere else, all of which is true, by the way. But the bottom line is that those freedoms are already being quashed for a portion of American citizens, right? And we need to listen to them and take our cues from them. And I think we need to take our cues from them in terms of the language that we use, whether it's often being uncomfortable. I said this in the pre-call we were chatting, embracing the importance of being outside your comfort zone, whether it's talking about apartheid or trying to really grapple with what settler colonialism as a framework means when talking about Palestinian rights, whether it's about actually talking about the situation on the ground, even though that maybe members of Congress are sick of hearing about it. The fact that we are a year after Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by, no question at this point, an IDF soldier. The question is whether it was on purpose or not. Seems pretty clear it was not an accident. The fact you have an American citizen, a journalist, a woman, and we still don't have any real response from the US. This is something to rally behind, and Palestinians are begging their non-Palestinian American compatriots to rally with them. So I think really listening and taking our cues from them. And here I also want to note the Palestinian rights movement has been, I think they are leading by example on what it means to have an intersectional approach, what it means to build alliances, because the bottom line is the US policy, the blind spot. If you read my friend Khalid Al-Gindi's book on this blind spot, the blind spot in US policy on Palestine is predicated on the idea that you can have a Palestine exemption to liberal values, right? And what Palestinian activists have been trying to do for years, and I think are finally really succeeding in doing, is saying to progressives, you're not progressive if you maintain an exception for Palestine. And some of this is generational. You have a younger generation, which, as a friend of mine says, is more interested in people and planets than they are in some political ideology they've inherited. And they don't understand the idea that you should have a principle that holds for everybody but this one conflict because, oh, it's complicated. It doesn't work for them. And you have an older generation, which is looking and saying, we actually bear the burden of fault for why we are here today, in part because we weren't brave enough, or we actually allowed ourselves to believe that we could get away with staying in our comfort zone, and that was enough. So, I think really, I don't know what mass peace action has done. I'm not trying to in any way claim that you say you haven't done these things, but my answer to this question in general, and there isn't a Palestinian speaker on this call, is ask Palestinians how you can best be an ally and listen to them and be an ally, because at this point they are leading and they're having impact.
Thank you. Just in terms of Massachusetts, we worked along with other organizations to defeat an anti-BDS bill in our state legislature a few years ago. And not surprisingly, there is a bill in the current session to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is, for those who don't know, it's a way of defining anti-Semitism that basically outlaws criticism of Israel. And we're working on that. So even though this is a big international issue, there are ways of sort of operating and working on it politically locally as well. We also have a bill that would forbid lobbyist paid travel. As you know, one of the tools that the pro-Israel organization in the United States use is to take people on carefully orchestrated tours of Israel, especially elected officials. And in Massachusetts, a state representative can't accept $50 from a lobbyist, but they can accept thousands of dollars worth of travel to Israel through a loophole in the bill. So we're working on that too. So let's, if you don't mind, unless you have something more to add right now, let's go to the questions. And I'm hoping Cole.
Can I add one thing, just very quickly, just on a positive point? I think it's, you mentioned defeating the NCBDS legislation. That's a sign I think people need to really take seriously. Local action can matter. It can defeat these. It's defeated these bills in numerous states. Oftentimes we see it by executive order anyway, but you still can defeat it. And it actually builds the groundwork for when something like this comes up at the federal level, because the 2 BDS related pieces of legislation have been reintroduced this year at the federal level. The other thing, though, I want to bring up is the IRA definition. So last week, the Biden administration released their anti-Semitism strategy. And the expectation of a lot of us was, certainly the people on the right, was that it was going to center and embrace the IRA definition. And worst case scenario for the right, it might give like a little, lip service to one of the other definitions, the nexus definition. That's not what they did at all. It didn't embrace IRA. It mentioned it in passing and called it the most prominent, which is not a value judgment. It's a description that's accurate because millions of dollars have gone into it. And it put it in the pot with a bunch of other definitions, all of which the Biden administration said was useful. That didn't happen on its own. That result was the result of concerted engagement from Palestinians, from Palestinian allies, from Jewish Americans, from other groups. It can make a difference, and people should never give up hope that it can.
Yeah, thank you. And pro-Israel organizations are busy trying to spin that, as you said, as a victory for the that definition, that pro-Israel definition of anti-Semitism. But I think you're right; it was actually a setback for them.
Yeah, my first question from Jean Sager, and she's asked it a couple of times, so she really wants this answered, is could you go deeper into the Nexus document, understanding anti-Semitism at its nexus with Israel and Zionism and how it relates to Palestinian human rights? And she notes that it was mentioned in Biden's recent anti-Semitism initiative. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, I can take, my understanding, I think Laura gets into this deeper in her coverage, but my understanding is that the Nexus document is kind of preferred by many progressives because it has a part that basically asserts that, some criticism of Israel cannot be deemed anti-Semitic, including like strident or harsh criticism of Israel or its policies. And there's been, I think we've run some analysis from both sides at our side about the Nexus document, but in contrast to the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which its critics point out is, well, first of all, the definition is just very vague and can be applied in all kinds of ways, and can be used pretty easily as a cudgel to kind of beat back Palestine advocacy. But it also controversially has a number of what it calls contemporary anti-Semitism examples, some of which include criticism of Israel, and those are also very vague. So I've read at least one op-ed from a right-wing pro-Israel writer, I think at JTA, declaring that Biden had turned his back on Jewish people by referencing the Nexus definition. And I would just point out that this IHRA, I expect, somebody who covers this, it seemed like a slam dunk in terms of the Biden administration adopting it the way that the Trump administration did. They publicly praised it many times. Anthony Blinken has too. They said they supported publicly. They keep on kicking it down the road. Now they say they are not going to revisit it until I think December of this year. In January, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights put out a fact sheet that detailed protections for students. I think pro-Israel crowd thought that they were going to get an IHRA working definition reference in that, and I certainly tried to put the pressure on for that, but they didn't get one either. It was omitted. So I think it's notable. Like Lara said, I think it speaks to all the work that's been done on this issue. But it also speaks to the fact that the people who are criticizing IHRA, have so much less in way of like resources and money, and it's like Kim Marcus who gets to write about it in Newsweek or like outlets and stuff. So it's victories like this are kind of even more impressive when you think about the resources that the other side has versus the side which is mainly activists, really.
Okay, Cole.
Okay, and then Richard Blake asks, has there been any progress with respect to governmental bullying of BDS support since the Abby Martin case?
I'll take that. I'm not sure what is meant by progress. I mean, the big news on anti-BDS legislation since the Abby Martin case is that the Arkansas case, the Arkansas Times, was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declined to hear it. The right spun that as the Supreme Court agreeing with the Eighth Circuit ruling. Anyone who knows anything about the Supreme Court knows the Supreme Court declines almost all cases that are appealed to it. They take a tiny, tiny fraction, and that in no way means that they are siding with either side. But the reality is that it leaves in place a ruling of the Eighth Circuit, which is, it's important, because, and it's important that people understand this. The Eighth Circuit ruling was not, it did not hold that barring boycotts of Israel is constitutional. It held that, or it did not rule that barring boycotts of Israel is unconstitutional. It barred that barring boycotts, period, is not unconstitutional, right? So essentially, it is a green light. It rewrites the constitutional understanding of the right to boycott being a kind of protected free speech under the First Amendment, which dates back to the Civil Rights era. It undermines it across the board for all issues, which, by the way, is going to be important sooner rather than later, because what we've seen for the past year is a flood of legislation, which is using anti-BDS laws as its template, a flood of legislation targeting the fossil fuel industry, the guns and ammunition industry, the whole range of red meat right-wing causes, essentially trying to punish them and protect them the same way they're punishing people who boycott Israel and protecting them the way they're trying to protect Israel. So we're probably going to see boycott cases sooner or later related to that, and they're going to suddenly find out that boycotts aren't protected free speech anymore. So that's the main development that I'm aware of.
Yeah,
remember that Israel, that in Texas, they used the anti-BDS legislation as a template for forbidding criticism of oil companies in Texas.
Well, it's not forbidding criticism of oil companies. It's basically it's the template. It's basically a divestment law and a law barring contracts. You lose the right to have contracts with the state. So it's not actually just it's not criticism, but it's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, Cole.
I'm going to venture to ask a question myself. I don't know if that's cheating. In terms of the big picture of why U.S. policy in relation to Israel and Palestine has remained almost constant for 70 years, what I heard in the opening remarks is it's sort of this nexus that was set into place in 1948. There's a variety of factors, and you just can't dislodge it. There's this challenge on the left, which is growing slowly. But we have seen other foreign policy cases where U.S. policy has changed widely. Let's take the example of China. At some point the business community decided they wanted to invest in China. So we had this whole round of rapprochement with China, and now then they turn and they say, no, China's getting too powerful. We're pulling everything out. We're starting a new Cold War, building up arms. There's like these major policy swings. So there's something more to me than just this sort of tradition of converging interests that holds this policy in place. And I just want to press on how we see that reason.
Well, I mean, I would, a very obvious point, and we've kind of maybe mentioned in passing, but it's something like we both cover a lot, I'm assuming, is, the fact that people who criticize Israel, particularly politicians, are smeared as anti-Semitic, and really, disgusting in vile ways. Rashida Tlaib has been attacked repeatedly by members of her own party as anti-Semitic. So I would just throw that out there as something that distinguishes this issue from other foreign policy issues, although there is obviously, similar sentiments when it comes to other foreign policy issues. But I think that we've seen such a concentrated effort from whether it's pro-Israel lobbying groups or pro-Israel voices or, lawmakers or Israeli politicians themselves to stifle, to not just stifle and censor Palestine advocacy, but to tag it as, an offshoot of terrorism, among other things. People probably saw something we covered at the site today, a commencement speaker at CUNY Law who referenced Israeli war crimes in her speech and is now being attacked publicly and bullied by lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, and has been thrown under the bus by her own school. So, and that's just, a graduating student. So if you're a higher profile person, I think, you could face even deeper consequences. And I think that's just something to keep in mind when we talk about this issue not moving forward.
If I could just add to that, I was going to a couple of things. Well, first, I would say that U.S. policy actually hasn't been constant, and I think Jeff did a good job laying out the ebbs and flows of U.S. relationship with Israel, and there have been highs and lows over time. I do want to say, though, I think if you're looking at a foreign policy issue as an analogy for U.S. relations with Israel, it's not China. China doesn't have a massive domestic U.S. constituency that sees this as a core identity issue. I think the analogies are Cuba. I think they are Armenia. When I used to, back in the old days before we had C-SPAN covering everything, when I used to go to hearings of the House Foreign Ops Subcommittee or the House Foreign Affairs Committee, you used to have to line up crazy early in the morning to actually get in because they let in very few people from the public. And the first people in line were all of us who worked on Israel, followed by the Armenians and then the Azerbaijan guys. And then everybody else. We were always the first people in line. And I talked to the folks from the Armenians. They knew which members, they knew where their voters were, and it was interesting. I agree very much with Michael, the fact that you can bring out the anti-Semitic card. And I mean, I grew up in Jewish American family, and I remember hearing, oh, this person's anti-Semitic. Why? Oh, they said something about Palestinians. It was just like knee jerk, in the 70s and 80s. That evolved after Oslo into something else, but now we're returning to that, and it's incredibly powerful. And the last thing, I mean, I'm someone who dares speak the name AIPAC probably more fluently or more casually than a lot of people, because I've been doing this for a really long time. But I'm old enough to remember, and I've attended enough AIPAC policy conferences over the years to remember that AIPAC used to produce like an annual booklet every year where they say they don't score members, but they clearly it was basically member pages and scorecards. And on the cover of that booklet, it used to be printed the logo, and it would say under it, rated as the most powerful foreign policy lobby in Washington or something like that. I mean, it matters, right? This is not a simple foreign policy issue. This is a domestic policy issue. China is a foreign policy issue where you have domestic interests. Israel is first and foremost. It is a domestic policy issue. And that's why you have AIPAC and company working with people and taking people on trips, like Jeff said, starting at the local level, bringing, if you go to the AIPAC policy conference, they've got student groups up there, they have groups of teachers, they have groups of police, they have student council presidents, they bring them up through this. They're playing a very long game, and they're playing it quite effectively.
And it strikes me one of the obstacles to change on our side is that single issue politics is very powerful. Progressives who support Palestinian rights support a lot of other things that also are high on their list of priorities. So, for example, we have Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's very progressive and terrific on lots of issues, pretty feeble on Israel and Palestine. But, what's the choice? And she's making this calculation too. How many of you are going to vote for my opponent because I'm not so good on Israel, whereas the pro-Israel people make it very clear: if you step out of line on our issue, we're going to come after you. And they do, of course, they have a track record. So there's this asymmetry a little bit. It's like the NRA and other single issue lobbyists that, they wield disproportional power because they focus on one issue only. And we have to reach the point, it seems to me, where progressives need to think about refusing to vote for a progressive candidate who's not good on this issue. Just as we wouldn't vote for a progressive who is good in every way except on civil rights, but we're a long way from that, given the organization of our election. So sorry for that digression, but it's a frustration for me, right? We have Elizabeth Warren, who's terrific in a lot of ways, and we push her and push her and push her on this issue, and she's weak. It's really weak on it. So sorry, Cole.
But given the alternatives, yeah. So a couple of questions on sort of this stuff of the Democratic primaries, AIPAC's role. So Julie Watkins says, deforming the primaries, voter suppression. I believe that corporate Democrats are not fighting as hard as they could because having means to prevent progressives from winning primaries is more important than winning in the general election. At least that's what seems to be happening. And then Susan Nicholson, our own from MAPA, says, do the speakers see the AIPAC PACs with their huge spending continuing to play a role in the Democratic primaries? I bet the answer is going to be yes from what I've heard already, but go ahead.
Yeah, I would say yes. I think there is a glass half full interpretation of the AIPAC Democratic stuff. On one hand, yes, they have infiltrated the primaries, and it's in a pretty terrible way. Although Lara points out that it's not like they're doing anything illegal. And in fact, they say as much, they tweet as much. When people confront them about how much money they spend, they just say, essentially, this is free speech. We have the same right to do it as everybody else does. And they're right, unfortunately. But I would say the amount of money that they're having to spend in some of these races, to me, is just staggering and incredible. And like we were saying before, I think it speaks to the fact that Democrats and others are kind of shifting when it comes to this issue. So I certainly expect them to continue to raise tons and tons of money and spend tons and tons of money. But I think their job is going to get harder and harder, especially as, and it's also been alluded to, the younger generation, how they view these things. I'm talking about Jewish Americans earlier. I think, Jewish Americans of a certain age obviously have an existential connection maybe to Israel and have for a long time, whereas, younger Jewish voters don't really have that connection. There was a poll maybe a year ago that Jewish Electorate Institute did that 38% of Jews or something under 40 think that Israel is an apartheid state. And something like 20% of Jewish voters under the age of 40 said that Israel doesn't have the right to exist. So, those are pretty staggering numbers in comparison to what we typically see portrayed in the mainstream. And then the other thing I'd point out is I saw Netanyahu on Face the Nation maybe about a month ago, who was kind of confronted about the shifting views of Democratic voters and how Israel was going to kind of hold up over time when it came to this. And he offhand made the point that he thought one of the reasons why support for Israel is diminishing is because he referred to it as collateral damage. He basically said Israel has to protect itself. People don't understand our security situation. And essentially, as a result of that, a lot of Palestinians often die, and then that is covered by the media. And he thought that essentially, if you read between the lines with that, it's kind of admitting that, we have a problem basically because people are beginning to see this wherever they get their media, whether it's, it's permeating the mainstream media a little, but maybe they go to independent media, or they see it on social media, or they use other sites where they can see what's actually happening in the region. And, when they see an American citizen, shot in the head by the IDF and nobody held accountable, I don't think you really have to have stride in politics or even be a leftist to kind of conclude that something's off and something has to be changed. So that's all to say, I think AIPAC and DMFI and these groups will keep spending big money, but I think they're going to have to spend more and more in order to to win these races, because I don't think the time is on their side when it comes to this.
And if I could just add two things to that, I agree with all of that. I would add that I also think in the next round of elections, you're not going to see Democrats caught flat-footed. I think they will be expecting something like this. By the way, I'm not sure AIPAC's going to, I mean, their goal, I think, in this last round was to have a chilling effect. I don't think their plan is to come in each round of primaries and do the same thing. I think they're hoping not to have to. But to the extent that you have progressive challengers, I suspect they will be better prepared so that they're not suddenly at the 11th hour caught flat-footed while somebody starts putting in tens of millions of dollars in ad money. And my understanding from people who work on election campaigns is you don't have to match it dollar for dollar. You just have to match it, you know, $1 for every $5 or whatever. There has to be some, you have to be in the running to break through that shift in public opinion that comes with mass advertising. The other thing I'll say, and we haven't talked about this here, is Israel is changing. And the way Israel is changing makes the current US engagement with Israel harder and harder to maintain. For years, support for Israel has been bipartisan. The odd artifact of that has been that you had right-wing Republicans supporting a country that has basically, you know, socialism and socialized medicine and kibbutzim and all of that. So you had this weird, you know, hypocrisy on the Republican side. Today, what you have is an Israel that is increasingly, I mean, openly, brazenly illiberal. The current regime is, you know, the word fascist gets tossed around. If you see what the effort is in terms of changing the Israeli judiciary, those words are not being used lightly. And let's be clear, the same group that is pushing to change Israel's laws domestically so that it looks more and more like an authoritarian, openly fascist regime are the same forces that are working to change US law to quash criticism of Israel and BDS. Not a coincidence. I think as Israel continues down this path, and they've been going down this path now for decades, but at this point, it's harder and harder for Democrats to kind of make the argument, well, listen, our relationship with Israel is bigger than one Israeli government. Okay, it's not one Israeli government. Bibi's back, and he's now got the most insanely right-wing government in Israel's history, and they've been pretty right-wing before, and they're doing insanely right-wing things every day. It gets harder and harder to defend, and I think that will fuel. I don't think that's the cause on its own of the shifts in U.S. opinion, but it will continue to fuel it, even if the legacy leadership of both parties doesn't want to see any change at all.
And just as a follow-up, as far as I think we can all tell, the far right in Israel is sort of giving up on American Jews and orienting their politics much more to the Republican Party, the evangelicals and Christian Zionists, believing, probably rightly, that many of the Jews are too liberal to ever be redeemed as stalwart pro-Israel defenders. So could you comment on this development of, you know, Israel's politics being oriented to the Republican Party and the evangelical base of it?
Yeah, I can take. Oh, so you go.
I'll just go very quickly. This isn't, yes, this is a major phenomenon. It's not new. I would encourage people to watch Till Kingdom Come. There's other movies about this. It's not new, but clearly it's incredibly pronounced right now. And let's be clear, this is something that I remember the first time I saw Joe Lieberman on the stage at the Christians United for Israel conference, standing there cheering with the same reverend who said that the Holocaust was God's way of getting the Jews to go to Israel. It was pretty surreal. But that's where they are today. And again, the cognitive dissonance that is required for progressive Americans in general and progressive Jewish Americans to stand up and defend a condition-free, impunity-driven relationship with Israel, while you have literally the Minister of Diaspora Affairs coming out with statements of open contempt for Jewish Americans because he doesn't like liberals. You know, that's his prerogative. He doesn't have to like liberals, but it's openly contemptuous. It's hard to see how this doesn't start to collapse under its own contradictions.
Okay, well, we're a little past 8 o'clock. Do you guys have a little more time to continue with questions, or?
I think Michael.
Let me bring one point up that I think might stimulate closing comments. A lot of the chat is really full of opinions more than questions, but here's one from Tina Leakopoulos that might be useful to end on. I cannot stomach this enormous atrocity anymore. It consumes me, and I feel rather helpless that no one does anything and that they justify support for this apartheid state. So what are we to do? It is not enough pressure. And are the Palestinians supposed to continue suffering while we hope for change? Like I said in my previous comment, I cannot stomach this inaction anymore. Maybe that will stimulate closing comments.
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly sympathize with the sentiment. I mean, we referenced this a little bit before about what people could do locally. I think, you know, the point is a good one, that Palestinians continue to suffer. I would just say, from the perspective, and I'm assuming the majority of people on the call live in the United States, you know, you can only take responsibility, I think, for it, you know, what you can control. And obviously, living in a place like the United States that has a certain amount of freedom, you bear a certain amount of responsibility to this country, this government's foreign policy and what it does. And I think the operative, you know, thing here is that we give, you know, Israel is able to do all this stuff because the United States gives them, you know, over $3.8 billion every year in military aid and money. And I think that's, you know, that should principally be the focus of people who live there, working to, you know, stop that and cut that off. And there's been some legislative effort, certainly, as we've referenced already. But I think, like I said, the scope of the situation it obviously seems very daunting, and it's a hard thing to consistently, you know, get people, you know, interested in to write about. But at the end of the day, I think it's important. It's important to keep in mind that everything Israel does, it's doing with full support of the United States, whether that's a president who comes out and just blatantly says that Israel can do whatever it wants, or it's a president who lets Israel do whatever it wants while, you know, voicing concern. And I just think that's something important to keep in mind. And I think it can, you know, we can have an impact on that potentially going forward, the same way that, you know, people were able to, you know, stop apartheid in South Africa, or, you know, many other historical examples. So I find it, you know, important to just kind of focus on our connection to this personally, because I do think we all kind of bear responsibility for it.
Thank you. Lara?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to what I said before. Like, someone far smarter than me had said that the antidote to despair is action. Obviously, we're talking to an action-oriented organization, so y'all already know that. But, you know, I think that's important. I'm going to go back to what I said before. I think this is a time to stand in support as an ally to Palestinians who are out there and who are telling us, you know, how they want us to support them. And, you know, they're focused on the Hill on the work of Congresswoman Tlaib and commemorate, you know, legitimizing talking about the Nakba, you know, around McCollum and her legislation around no way to treat a child. By the way, I'm not lobbying for any of these. My organization does not lobby. This is just informational. But I mean, there's stuff out there. And there's Palestinian partners who will, I think, happily give you space to support them. But I just will go back to something we've said before, and I think, you know, your voices matter. You are constituents, you are voters, you are Americans, and this is, as Michael said, fundamentally what has enabled this situation for, you know, all of my lifetime, most of all of our lifetimes, is the support. And it's not just the financial support, it's the diplomatic support, right? It's preventing the UN from doing anything. You know, as Jeff said at the beginning, it's the vetoing of UN Security Council resolutions. It's the imposition of a double standard. You know, and the argument is always, don't be mean to Israel, you're using a double standard. But by the way, we insist that there be a double standard for Israel when it comes to holding us accountable for anything we do. And the US makes that possible with financial and political support. And that's what I think, you know, activists are trying to challenge, and they're trying to challenge it not based on holding Israel to a different standard, but actually demanding that you hold Israel to the same standard as everybody else in US foreign policy. And by the way, US foreign policy isn't perfect, it's full of hypocrisies. But that doesn't mean that this isn't right. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean that trying to hold Israel accountable for its actions is anti-Semitic, because it's not.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, let me invite all of you who are participating If you're in Massachusetts, you can get active with organizations like MAPA or other organizations that work on this issue. If you live elsewhere, I'm sure you can find organizations that work on changing U.S. policy around Palestine and Israel. That's MAPA's main focus. I mean, BDS and a lot of other activities are important, but we have a history and an infrastructure that's mainly focused on elected officials and policy change. So we would welcome any of you who are participating today to join us or other organizations. And this is the way change happens, one person at a time, one movement at a time. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And we'll continue to appreciate Michael and Lara, your work, which is just part of our toolkit every week. And thank you very much for everything that you're doing. Okay. I guess we're done.
Thanks for having us.